How does a dead man have a living child? Thomas Martinez stared at the discarded note in disbelief. A young patient had thrown away what appeared to be a school project, a family tree with photos and descriptions. But the photo of the father showed a soldier in dress uniform, and the child had written, "My father died before I was born in the war." When Dr. Richard Hayes saw the photograph, his reaction was immediate and devastating. This wasn't just any soldier. This was his brother Marcus, supposedly killed in action in 2004. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast their familiar sterile glow as Thomas Martinez pushed his cleaning cart through the pediatric ward. At 48, he had been working the night shift as a hospital janitor for 15 years, moving through corridors like a ghost while the medical staff saved lives around him. He took pride in his work. Keeping the hospital clean wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, especially in the children's wing where tiny patients needed every advantage in their fight for health. Thomas preferred the night shift. The hospital was quieter, the hallways less chaotic, and he could work without constantly navigating around doctors, nurses, and anxious families. He'd learned to move invisibly through the medical world, emptying trash cans, mopping floors, and sanitizing surfaces while being virtually ignored by everyone around him. Room 314 was his next stop, a pediatric cancer ward where 8-year-old patients fought battles no child should face. As Thomas emptied the small wastebasket beside the bed, a crumpled piece of paper caught his attention. Normally, he wouldn't look twice at discarded hospital trash, but something about the bright crayon colors peeking through the crumpled ball made him pause. He smoothed out the paper on his card. It was clearly a school assignment. "My family tree," written in careful teacher's handwriting at the top. Below that, in the uncertain letters of a young child, someone had attempted to fill in their family history. The project showed stick figure drawings connected by lines, with photographs taped beside some of the figures. Most of the spaces were empty or marked with question marks, but one photo immediately drew Thomas's attention. It was a formal military portrait, a young man in army dress uniform, his expression serious and proud. Beneath the photo, in block letters that suggested great concentration, the child had written, "My father, Sergeant Marcus Hayes. He died in Afghanistan before I was born in 2004. My mom says he was a hero. I wish I could have met him." Thomas felt a familiar pang of sympathy. The pediatric ward was full of children dealing with more than their share of tragedy, and this little patient, apparently, had lost his father before ever knowing him. But something about the photograph nagged at him. The face looked familiar, though Thomas couldn't place where he might have seen it. He was about to throw the paper away when he remembered Dr. Richard Hayes, the hospital's chief of surgery. Hayes, the same last name as the soldier in the photo. It could be coincidence, but Thomas had learned that in a hospital, coincidences sometimes meant more than they appeared. Dr. Richard Hayes was a legend at St. Mary's. At 55, he was one of the most respected cardiac surgeons on the East Coast, known for taking on impossible cases and somehow making miracles happen. He was also known for being intensely private, arriving early, staying late, and dedicating his entire life to his work. Thomas had cleaned Dr. Hayes' office countless times over the years, but they'd rarely spoken beyond polite greetings. Still, something about the discarded family tree project bothered him enough to break that pattern. He found Dr. Hayes in his office at 6 a.m., already reviewing surgical notes for the day's operations. The surgeon looked up with mild surprise when Thomas knocked on the open door. "Thomas, right? Is everything okay?" "Dr. Hayes, I'm sorry to bother you, but I found something in the pediatric ward that I thought you might want to see." Thomas handed over the smoothed-out family tree project. "The last name caught my attention. I thought maybe—" Dr. Hayes took the paper with polite interest, but the moment his eyes fell on the military photograph, his entire body went rigid. The color drained from his face so quickly that Thomas stepped forward in alarm. "Dr. Hayes, are you all right?" The surgeon was staring at the photo with an expression of absolute shock, his hands beginning to tremble. The paper fluttered to his desk as Dr. Hayes gripped the edge of his chair, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Where did you find this?" he whispered. "Room 314. One of the young patients threw it away. I thought since the name was Hayes, you might. Dr. Hayes stood abruptly, swayed, and then collapsed back into his chair, his face now completely white. Thomas rushed around the desk, genuinely concerned that the man was having some kind of medical episode. Should I call someone? Do you need help? No, Dr. Hayes managed to say, his voice barely audible. Just close the door, please. Thomas did as asked, then stood uncertainly as Dr. Hayes picked up the photo with shaking hands, studying every detail of the young soldier's face. Dr. Hayes, do you know this person? This is Marcus, Dr. Hayes said, so quietly that Thomas had to strain to hear him. This is my little brother. Your brother? The child wrote that his father died in Afghanistan. He did die in Afghanistan. Dr. Hayes looked up at Thomas with eyes full of confusion and pain. Marcus died in 2004. I have his Purple Heart in my desk drawer. I spoke at his memorial service. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. But sir, if your brother died in 2004, how can there be a child upstairs who says this soldier is his father? Dr. Hayes stared at the photo for a long moment before answering. I don't know, but I intend to find out. The next hour was a blur of activity. Dr. Hayes canceled his morning surgeries and accompanied Thomas to the pediatric ward, where they learned that the child who had created the family tree was named David Hayes, age 8, currently being treated for leukemia. David was a small boy with thin brown hair and large eyes that seemed too old for his young face. When Dr. Hayes entered the room, introduced as another doctor who wanted to ask about his school project, David's reaction was immediate and startling. You look like him, David said simply, pointing at the military photo that Dr. Hayes still carried. You look like my daddy. Dr. Hayes sat down slowly beside the bed, his voice gentle despite his obvious emotional turmoil. David, can you tell me about your father? About this photograph. My mom gave it to me. She said he was a soldier who died fighting bad guys before I was born. She said he was brave and that he would have loved me very much. Where is your mother now? David's face fell. She got sick like me, but she didn't get better. She died last year. That's when I came to live with the Hendersons, their foster parents. Dr. Hayes exchanged a glance with Thomas. David, what was your mother's name? Sarah Hayes. But her name used to be Sarah Mitchell before she married my daddy. Dr. Hayes felt the room spin around him. Sarah Mitchell. He remembered her now, a young nurse who had worked at a military hospital in Germany. Marcus had mentioned her in his letters home, had even sent a photo of them together. But Marcus had died before he could marry her, before he could come home from his deployment. Or so Richard had thought. David, Dr. Hayes said carefully, I need to ask you something very important. Do you know when you were born? March 15th, 2005. The date hit Richard like a physical blow. March 2005, 5 months after Marcus was supposedly killed in action in October 2004. Thomas, Richard said quietly, could you give David and me some privacy? After Thomas left, Richard pulled up a chair next to David's bed. David, I think your father and I might have been related. Would it be okay if I asked you some more questions? Over the next hour, David told Richard everything he knew about his father. Sarah had kept detailed records, letters Marcus had written, photos they'd taken together, even official military documents. She'd told David that his father had been recalled for one final mission just before David was born, and that he'd died heroically saving his fellow soldiers. But as Richard listened, pieces of a very different puzzle began forming in his mind. Military protocols, timing of notifications, the suspicious lack of details about Marcus's death. Things he'd been too grief-stricken to question 20 years ago. That afternoon, Richard made a series of phone calls that would change both their lives forever. He contacted the Department of Defense, the Veterans Administration, and finally, a private investigator who specialized in military records. What they uncovered was a web of bureaucratic errors, mistaken identities, and cover-ups that had kept two brothers apart for 20 years. Marcus Hayes hadn't died in Afghanistan. Another soldier with a similar name, Marcus Hayes, spelled differently, had been killed in the same unit on the same day. In the chaos of war and military bureaucracy, the wrong family had been notified, the wrong funeral had been held, and the wrong Purple Heart had been awarded. The real Marcus Hayes had been severely wounded in the same attack that killed Marcus Hayes, but he'd survived. However, he'd suffered traumatic brain injury that left him with severe memory loss and confusion about his identity. He'd been evacuated to a military hospital in Germany, where he'd spent months in rehabilitation. During his recovery, he'd met and fallen in love with Sarah Mitchell, a nurse assigned to his care. They'd married quickly, knowing he would soon be deployed again. But when Marcus's unit was reassigned to a classified mission, all communication with families was cut off for security reasons. By the time Marcus was cleared to contact his family, the military had already informed them of his death. When he tried to reach out, he was told that his family had moved on, that it would be cruel to disrupt their grieving process. Confused by his head injury and trusting military authorities, Marcus had accepted this explanation. He'd built a new life with Sarah in Germany, where David was born. They'd lived there for several years before moving back to the United States, where Marcus worked various jobs while struggling with ongoing effects of his brain injury. Sarah had kept all the military documents and photos, planning to someday help David connect with his father's family. But Sarah had died of cancer the previous year, and David had entered foster care before anyone could piece together his family history. The most heartbreaking part was that Marcus was still alive. The private investigator found him living in a veterans facility in Colorado, still struggling with memory issues and believing his family thought he was dead. 2 weeks later, Richard Hayes drove to Colorado with 8-year-old David, who was experiencing a temporary remission from his leukemia. The reunion at the veterans facility was emotional beyond words. Marcus, now 43 but looking older due to his injuries and difficult life, initially didn't recognize Richard. 20 years in trauma had changed them both significantly. But when David ran toward him calling Daddy, something clicked in Marcus's damaged memory. "You have my eyes," Marcus said wonderfully, picking up his son for the first time. Then, looking at Richard, recognition slowly dawned. "Richie, is that really you?" The brothers held each other and cried while David watched with the wise eyes of a child who had seen too much sadness but was finally witnessing joy. The reunion was just the beginning. Richard immediately arranged for Marcus to receive the best medical care available, helping him deal with ongoing effects of his brain injury. He also became David's legal guardian, giving the boy access to the best pediatric oncology treatment while Marcus worked on his recovery. 6 months later, David's leukemia was in remission, and Marcus had improved enough to live in a supervised apartment near Richard's home. The brothers were slowly rebuilding their relationship, and David was thriving with both his father and his uncle in his life. Thomas Martinez was invited to David's 9th birthday party, a celebration that wouldn't have been possible if he hadn't noticed a discarded school project in a hospital wastebasket. As he watched the Hayes family laughing together around the birthday cake, he reflected on the strange turns life could take. "You know," Richard said to Thomas that day, "people always talk about medical miracles happening in hospitals. But sometimes the real miracles come from the people who clean up after us, who notice the small things that everyone else overlooks." Thomas smiled, thinking about all the trash he'd emptied over the years, all the discarded papers he'd never looked at twice. "I guess you never know what you might find if you pay attention." Indeed, Richard agreed, watching Marcus help David blow out his birthday candles. Sometimes what we throw away is exactly what someone else needs to find. David looked up from his cake, frosting on his cheek, and grinned at the assembled adults. "I'm glad my school project ended up in the right trash can." They all laughed, but there was truth in the child's innocent observation. Sometimes miracles come disguised as garbage. Family connections are found in wastebaskets, and the people we think are gone forever are just waiting for someone to notice they're still there. The Hayes family learned that love doesn't die just because paperwork says it should, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by the people who society considers invisible. Thomas Martinez returned to his night shift at the hospital, but now he paid even closer attention to the things people threw away. After all, you never know when someone's discarded past might be exactly what they need to reclaim their future.